Morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the ASRI WCCO Global Citizens for Social Justice Conference. This is panel discussion 2. The topic of this discussion is the role of civil society in holding government and the private sector accountable. Can I ask before we start formally for you all to please put your phones on silent? And feel free to tweet at the hashtag Global Citizens 2019, also the hashtags WCCO and the hashtag ASRI. So let's share our thoughts, experiences, and ideas with the wider sort of Twitterverse out there and not just limited to this room. So I'm very pleased to have with me two very prominent individuals in South African civil society. They're so modest, so Sean on the side of me is like, oh God, you know. But they are, I think, to many of us who've been following happenings in South Africa over at least the last 5 years would have seen both Sean and David very prominent in the public space in terms of holding both government and the private sector accountable. And they'd speak about that a little more, but I'm just going to do a brief introductions for both of them quickly. So Sean is the executive director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. He is a Wits alumni in education, if I'm not mistaken, and he also has a master's in public policy from the University of London, a former advisor to the MEC for Education, a former deputy director of the Department of Local Government in Gauteng, as well as serving and having served on numerous civil society and civic organizations, including the ANC structures, the structures of the United Democratic Movement, United Democratic Front, United Democratic Front, and one letter can change everything, eh? The UDF, the ANC, and he was also a former member of MK Underground. David Lewis, next to me, is the Executive Director of Corruption Watch. He was a former chair of the Competition Tribunal. He's a trade unionist, having held the office of Secretary General of the General Workers Union, was also a national organizer of the Transport and General Workers Union, also a Wits alumni in economics. He formerly directed UCT's Development Policy Unit. He was a special advisor to the Minister of Labor in the early 90s, so during the early years of our democracy. He participated in drafting the Competition Act, and we're hoping that he'll speak a little bit about competition between public companies or private sector companies as well. He was a former deputy chair of the IDC board, Industrial Development Corporation Board, and has also authored a book titled Thieves at the Dinner Table, Enforcing the Competition Act, a Personal Account. So I'm going to start with Sean on my right. I'd like Sean to please speak about the work of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, and also maybe share with us some of Uncle Kathy's thoughts and I guess emotions during the last few years of his life, specifically when he became more public and outspoken around government corruption and the society that he was seeing evolving around us. So Sean, please.
No, thank you, and good morning to everybody. I don't like the kind of description that Mohammed has given about profile, but that's not the issue here. I think it's just wonderful being here. I had prepared on something slightly different, but let me try and respond. So this foundation is fundamentally premised on taking forward the values, the principles, and the life legacy of Ahmed Kathrada. And we do that in a number of ways through a foundation which he established almost 11 years ago. A foundation whose core value is to look at the entrenchment and the deepening of non-racialism in South Africa, but a non-racialism that is not premised on being colorblind. It's a non-racialism that has got deep historical roots in actions of solidarity, in rejections of issues of broader othering of people in society, and fundamentally a more inclusive, just, and equal society. And we do this work through the promotion of liberation history. We do it through a program of strengthening democracy, which I'll come back to. Um, we do it through a program of youth leadership and development. And that's really the big focus of ours for the next 10 years, is to develop youth activism in communities through the establishment of youth clubs, the first 10 of which are being formed in the south of Johannesburg, from Soweto to Orange Farm. And through these youth clubs, young people really take on the issues of social justice, issues of accountability, but also the issues of young people and providing safe places for them to play and talk and be young people. Um, we do a program on building non-racialism through tackling racism in society. And there our flagship is building the anti-racism network in South Africa, which is something we started with the Mandela Foundation. And that has grown nationally and will be formalized in November at its conference in Johannesburg. Um, but the program on strengthening democracy, at this point in time, its core focus is on attempting to ensure that the issue of state capture becomes one that I think broader society begins to be remobilized around. And if you look at our first entry point into this issue was in 2013 with the landing of the Gupta plane at Bataclan. That for the Kathrada Foundation was the very first time in our very first statement raising concerns about this and concluding that statement with saying that what South Africa needs to understand is how a family that comes from India in a short space of time can become so powerful that they can do such brazen acts like land a plane there, lie to all kinds of people, be escorted by police to Sun City, at Sun City host a huge wedding, treat people in the most racist manner, and what now emerges is in fact the wedding gets paid for by taxpayers of South Africa. And if anything, that symbolizes the kind of, at that point in time, we didn't know how deep this goes. In fact, a number of analysts ridiculed our statement by saying, well, you can't draw those connections. This is a flash in the pan thing. And we've now seen Ambassador Kolwani at the commission initially denying it, now saying, well, you did name drop and put pressure on people, but still, in our view, not coming close to the actual facts. Um, and that raises the broader issues of accountability. So that was the first thing that Kathrada was concerned about, that these were signals that things were moving in a very different direction. For him, as his life progressed, in December 2016, started penning a open letter to President Zuma. Well, it in fact started 2 months before, but by December he had finalized the draft and held back publishing it. Refined that in March after the public protectors, what was 2015? Yeah. By 2016, when the public protector released a report, and when the president apologized, but really didn't apologize or take responsibility for the findings of that report, he simply said, look, he has now decided that for the first time in his 75 years of activism, he now needs to speak out against his own party first and foremost, and publish his letter. Huge support for that letter in public. In private, however, almost every entity that had been supporting the foundation financially, and we rely a lot on donations and sponsorships, all of them pulled away from us. Nobody wanted to be seen in public. But in private, we're very happy. Fast forward to his death. As he lay there in his hospital bed, one of the unenviable tasks of being a executive director is that you have to sit with people when they are close to death and say, well, what do you want? What do you want about where must you be buried? And first he said, well, it's in Swaziland. And I said, man, that's 5.5 hours here. If you die at night and you have to be buried in the morning, we're not driving 5.5 hours. Besides, the potholes in Swaziland at night will just damage every vehicle. He considered and said, okay, Johannesburg. Then I said to him, well, who should or shouldn't be at your funeral? And he said very clearly to us, he doesn't want the president there. He doesn't want him to speak. I had to then convey this message to the leadership of the ANC, and they conveyed it to President Zuma. And you'll read today that they now disclaim that and say he didn't even write his letter himself. Um, and obviously, then his funeral becomes a major rallying point for just a much more visible outspokenness about state capture. And a lot of people have been doing that before. But this, I think, took on a much more visible form. So his life, as we've examined it now, was 75 years of activism from the age of 12 to 77. Um, and it's just one remarkable legacy that we are now trying to take forward in the small ways that we can as a small foundation based in Lenasia.
Thank you, Sean. So over to David now. David, please can you speak to the work of Corruption Watch since its launch, I think, in 2012, as well as the, uh, your insights and your thoughts on what Sean spoke about, which is state capture, the involvement of the Guptas as a private company entity, etc., and its tentacles spreading into the state, and how we got here, how we got to this point. Thank you.
Is that on? Yeah, thanks, Mohammed, and thanks for inviting us here. You know, the last time I spoke at an ASRI event, which I think was about 3 years ago, uh, one of the people who was at the event asked if she could come and intern for us at Corruption Watch for 2 weeks, and she came, and we've never allowed her to leave since. She's still there. She has flu today. Unfortunately, she can't be here. But so I owe a debt of gratitude to ASRI. I have to say. You know, I'll speak to what Mohammed asked me to speak. But what one of the privileges of being able to abuse being here is to actually be able to speak about what you want. And so I want to, you know, yesterday when I was thinking about what I would say here today, I thought, you know, I'll do my usual thing of explaining what Corruption Watch is and what we do, and hopefully that way it will tell you how we try to hold government and the private sector, powerful interests, to account. But I thought I would speak to you first about what a civil society organization is. And I landed up tying myself in complete knots. So I want to ask you some questions. And this is not a case of the panelist who knows the answers to the questions asking you to demonstrate to you how clever he is and how stupid you are. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I'd be interested in your answers. But tell me first, and tell me honestly, how many of you, before you came here today or you saw the program, how many of you had ever heard of Corruption Watch? Can you give me an indication? And how many of you had ever heard of the Kathrada Foundation? Yeah. Now that's quite interesting because I'm sure Sean would agree with me that if you were getting your information from the media, you would probably have heard more about Corruption Watch than the Kathrada Foundation. As I'll explain to you, the media is a very important instrument for our operating model. So clearly, you're not getting your information about knowledge of the Kathrada Foundation and knowledge of Corruption Watch from the media. So where are you getting it from? Why have you heard more about the Kathrada Foundation then you've heard about Corruption Watch. Well, apart from how good looking the executive director is, but how why do you think that is the case? Okay, that's yeah, yes, 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 yeah. Any other guesses at this? Let's maybe return to that because I think it has something to do, and you might not like to hear this answer. I think it has something to do with the fact that Ahmed Kathrada is a great national leader, and but he's also a person identified strongly with the community. He's a great leader of his community. The Kathrada Foundation espouses universal issues, but it derives a lot of its recognition, as one of you put it, from the identity of its patron, but also from the identity of its patron as a leader of a community. I mean, Corruption Watch's task, although I appreciate your answer, and that's a great first lesson to Corruption Watch. Corruption Watch has a more difficulty in identifying a community from which it grows out of. We tackling our community are the residents and citizens of South Africa. The Kathrada Foundation has an easy identification with the community, which acts as a springboard, I think, for its recognition and for its activity. And the important thing that I wanted to get across there is that civil society, organizations, and community are inextricably bound up together. We purport to represent the interests of communities, um, which doesn't mean we don't represent universal issues and universal rights, but we attempt to articulate the interests of a community or communities. And I don't know that we've successfully managed to build a community of interest. I think the Kathrada Foundation has successfully been able to do that for a variety of reasons, some of which are some of which we don't really want to acknowledge, but I think it's partly true. But so my next question is that when you knew you were going to have a session on civil society organizations today, and here you see in front of you Corruption Watch and the Kathrada Foundation, are you surprised that we should be here? Are you wondering why should it be that these two organizations are called here to talk about civil society? Probably not, I would say. We're kind of identified, I imagine, in your mind and the mind of a lot of others, as civil society organizations. I mean, would you have been surprised to find Business Leadership South Africa here? Why? Would you have been surprised to find the unions here, a union representative here? You wouldn't have been surprised to find a union representative here because they represent labor, who is fighting for labor rights. But business, who is fighting for property rights, you would be surprised to find here, the rights of their community. Would you have been surprised to find the churches represented here? Would you have been surprised to find AfriForum here? You wouldn't have been surprised. Yeah, because I found, great difficulty yesterday thinking about this is what is a civil society organization? I know that when the Kathrada Foundation would you have expected to find Amnesty International here, or the Gift of the Givers, or the Red Cross? Are these civil society organizations, in your estimation? Is ASRI a civil society organization? Yeah, you see, it strikes me sometimes when the Kathrada Foundation invites civil society organizations to come and have a meeting to talk about something we need to talk about, we have in common. I get there, I know exactly who's going to be there before I get there. There may be one or two surprises. When we have a meeting to bring civil society together to talk about civil society, they're exactly the same people. Maybe give or take one or two. And we're a tiny fraction of what civil society is in the country. It's huge, and there are a huge array of organizations, from massive international organizations like the World Wildlife Federation, or Amnesty, or Oxfam, down to the tiniest little community organization providing a daycare center for single children, or for children-led households. This is the sort of range of organizations that we have, and we all purport to try and identify the interests of the community. Some of us provide services, concrete services to that community. Others, and I think the Kathrada Foundation and ourselves fall into this category, is that we try, maybe it applies more closely to us, we try to pressurize government and the private sector to do what they should be doing, but particularly government, and we can talk about that in a moment, to do what they should be doing in order to advance the rights, the socio-economic rights, the political rights of the community of South Africans. That's what certainly Corruption Watch is about. We don't purport to be a police force, although we do a certain amount of investigation. We don't purport to provide the services that are necessary to combat corruption. But what we do is we try and mobilize the public to participate in fighting corruption. And the manner in which they do that is by putting pressure on the institutions of the state and the institutions of the private sector that have the resources and the power and the capacity and the duty to combat corruption. You know, one of the things that civil society organizations, even some of the big ones, have in common is that we are always tackling a problem that is much, much bigger than the resources that we have to tackle it. And so we have to make a very, very big ripples from throwing a very small pebble into a huge, huge pond. And so everything we do is about amplifying all of our individual actions to make a national impact, even a global impact at some stage. And this is what an organization like Corruption Watch is about. But let me now speak to my mandate. So we were formed, as Mohammed said, in 2012 in response to what was growing evidence of corruption. This was, if you recall, 3 years after the Zuma administration uh, began. But corruption didn't begin with the Zuma administration. I mean, we've all heard of the sort of iconic arms deal and the corruption in the arms deal, which happened under the Mandela and the Mbeki administrations. But I think that it's true to say that while there was certainly corruption in the years preceding the Zuma administration, and I'm only talking since 1994. I take it that we all agree that in the apartheid regime was a corrupt regime by definition in every single instance. But I'm talking since 1994. There was certainly corruption in the Mandela and Mbeki regimes, and I think that some of the corruption of the governing party started in those years, as the party attempted, and the party leaders attempted to fund itself. But it was it was at manageable proportions, if you like, in those years. I mean, from the period of the Zuma regime, it really headed off into the stratosphere, and it's become known to all of us, I think, in this room, as the era of state capture, a form of political corruption where the institutions of the state, the decision-making structures of the state, are overtaken by moneyed interests. So it's not just this procurement deal or that procurement deal that is corrupted. It's rather those who make decisions about procurement or about government appointments to senior public positions that characterizes the state capture era. So we were formed at the, if you like, in the early years of the of the state capture era, and our avowed objective, our purpose, is to encourage and enable the public to report, to engage in combating corruption, to participate in combating corruption. And the way that we do that in the first instance is by providing platforms and encouraging the public to report experiences of corruption to us, which they have done since 2012 at the rate of about 150 reports a week. Sometimes it spikes higher in response to certain initiatives, sometimes it's lower. So we've gathered in the period since 2012 something in excess of about 25,000 reports of corruption, and we treat these in a variety of ways. You'll appreciate that these reports are at a very different, are very diverse, both in quality and in the kind of quality of information we get, and in the kind of corruption that is reported. They may range from help the traffic cop asked me for a cool drink to, an 800 million rand tender has been corrupted in Ekuleni, and here are reams of information and dossiers of information. So we get a very diverse array of reports, and we treat these reports in a variety of ways. The one thing that we do is these reports are captured on quite a sophisticated software program that allows us to analyze the reports in pretty much close to real time. So we're able to identify patterns of corruption and hotspots of corruption. And they're not always what you'd expect. I mean, we were very surprised to find when we started that one of the most prevalent area in which corruption was reported was in the management of schools' resources, each one amounting to a relatively small amount of money compared to what you're hearing about at the Zondo Commission, but with huge human interest impact. And these were the most prevalent reports that we got. But all other usual suspects as well: procurement, licensing centers, housing allocation, health, public health, the police, very prevalent reports of corruption. So we analyze these reports and we identify, as I say, patterns and hotspots of, of corruption. We do a certain amount of investigation, but you can imagine that a small, under-resourced NGO can't investigate more than a tiny fraction of the reports that we receive. But we do a certain amount of investigation. We select strategically what it is that we want to investigate, and we undertake those investigations. Sometimes the fruits of the investigation go to the police, sometimes to the institutions concerned, sometimes to the media. So we do a certain amount of investigation. We do quite a lot of policy advocacy, reports and other events in the country lead us to develop policy positions. They may be on how to protect whistleblowers, how to combat money laundering, how to fund political parties, all issues that are very pertinent to combating corruption. So we do a large amount of that. Um, we mount campaigns, and the reports are very strong guides to the campaigns that we mount. So our first campaign was a campaign directed at schools corruption, and it taught us an enormous amount, and I think has had an impact on the governance of schools. We have mounted a variety of other campaigns, and I'll tell you maybe in question time about some of the campaigns we now have, particularly in policing, which has arguably become the central focus of our work. But the core thing about whatever we do, whatever of these treatments are, is that we report back to the public on what it is we've done. We've done one investigation in the school. We use the media to report it back to the public. We submit a policy document to Parliament or to a government department. We make sure the public knows about it. We mount a campaign. We make it as public as we can do. And the reason for that is to engage the public in doing what we're doing. Because as far as we're concerned, there is no fighting corruption without mobilizing public opinion against it. There are many countries. India might be one such country. Russia is certainly one such country where the public have come to accept that there's nothing you can do about corruption. It's a tax. It's a way of life. And don't try and buck it. There's nothing you can do. The thing that gives me most hope about South Africans is that I don't think they've come to that conclusion yet. But once we come to that conclusion, the possibility of fighting corruption is going to be a really, really difficult task. And so we constantly make a lot of noise. My young daughter tells me that I'm a media slut. I try to tell her I'm a public intellectual, but she's having nothing of it. She's embarrassed by the number of times that I appear in the media. But if by that she understands that I'm in the media more than she wants to see me in the media, I'm fine about that. Because that's what we want to do. We rely on the media for our ability to communicate with the public. But increasingly, we are also engaging with communities. So that's become a more and more important part of our work. And it's a very challenging part of our work because you can go and engage with the governing bodies of 25 schools, and that's a huge task about how to fight corruption. But when you know that there are 24,000 schools in the country, how are you making an impact on those other 23,950 schools? When you go and engage with particular communities around their police stations, how do you affect the communities that you can't get to? And that's through publicity, it's through policy advice, it's through strategic litigation. One comrade there said he'd heard about us in sort of court cases. We do a lot of those, and those also, you could spend your entire life in court. But we haven't got the resources to do that, and we're not that kind of organization. So we have to select very strategically what what it is that we want to do when we go to court. So, for example, at the moment, the biggest piece of litigation that we're going to be involved in is an attempt to ask the court to declare 5 former ESCOM board directors, Brian Molefe and a number of others, who've clearly been involved in gross corruption, delinquent, so that they can be prevented from ever serving on a board of directors again. Now, we do that in order to demonstrate that there are consequences of corruption, and to say to anybody else who thinks that they're going to accept a board membership of a state-owned enterprise, that they can just look at what the fee is that they get and the good commercial opportunities that they earn. If that's their attitude, they'd best stay away, because there's a possibility that there will be a court action that will prevent them from ever becoming a director of the board of a state-owned enterprise or any other company for that matter again. So that's the way we do our work. The principle, as I've said, and I'll conclude here, and we can talk in question time, but the principle, as I've said, is to encourage and enable public participation in combating corruption. The call to action, the first call to action, is report experiences of corruption to us. And we hope by that to impart the fact that without whistleblowers, there's no combating corruption. Corruption is not like an assault where there's a victim lying on the ground and you see who the victim is, and the victim, if he or she is still alive, can report you to the police. Corruption is where two corrupt bodies are engaging together, usually a private sector and a public sector player, and they're not going to report to you that they've engaged in corruption because both are equally guilty. It's those who are not there who suffer the consequences of corruption. And on those rare occasions when they see it, they have to blow the whistle. So this is what our object, the call to action, is to report experience of corruption, and we act on it in the variety of ways that I described to you. But critically, we report those activities back to the public, and that's really essentially what the work of Corruption Watch is. I brought a couple of our annual reports. I'm afraid there are only about 10 copies here. And you should have a look at them because this is not just a sort of corporate report. It's a very important instrument for us. It generates a lot of publicity, which, as I've described to you, is what we want to do. But it's also, I think, an unusually informative, detailed report. And please feel free to share them or take them.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very glad that you also spoke about the practicalities of holding people accountable, the consequences. And Ibrahim Fakir spoke about this in the first session when he said, without consequences, really, there's no accountability because there's no reason for anyone to act against their own personal interests. And I'm sure you'd ask more questions around that during question time. Sean, I'm going to come back to you before going to the floor. We know that, the corruption, first and foremost, has the biggest impact on the poor. And not just corruption, but also mismanagement, ineffectiveness of governance, especially in the public sector. Most prominently through, the state being the great equalizer in society, redistributing of resources between areas where they most needed in terms of public services, housing, healthcare, education, etc., etc. But the question I'd like to ask, and the reason I ask this is because the AKF was one of the first organizations from civil society to start filling the vacuum where civil society was really quiet and cowed in some ways from speaking out during the last 5 years of the Zuma presidency. So, my question to you really, or for you to speak to, is how did we get here? Was there a failure of civil society uh, during the late 90s, early 2000s? And what do you feel is happening or needs to happen within civil society to rejuvenate its role within a constitutional democracy of maintaining the accountability of not just the public sector but also the private sector?
No, thank you. Let's just start on how David started. I mean, how many of you voted in the last election? Okay. Okay, very good. How many of you voted in the municipal elections? 2016. Good. How many of you know the names of your councillor? Okay, just give them. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of you have engaged with that councillor on anything? 1, 2. How many of you have actually attended a council meeting? In Joburg, you've sat in a committee meeting. No? How many of you have gone through the budgets of the city? 2. Now, you've elected people in the last election. Of the 400 MPs, other than those in cabinet, how many of you know more than 10 of them? Their names, their contact details, and where you can find them tomorrow to raise any issue. Mike. And that's really been the problem from 1994. We go through the motion, we take part in the election. Thereafter, for a whole host of reasons and really, real difficulties, we are unable to take it a step further. So my key questions would have been, who should be accountable? For what should they be accountable? How should they be accountable? And to whom should they be accountable? So you would have voted for a party in this election. You didn't vote for candidates. So in work that we did prior to the election with young people, so before we ran a whole voter education exercise, we did a mock election. Now normally people do it at the end. We did it at the start. We did the election, and then I went back to the question, on what basis did you vote? Because you don't know who the candidates are. You don't know them. You haven't even read the manifestos. And it was simply on who was the most visible, who was the most vocal on social media, and what your parents had told you. 3 weeks later, we went through the same exercise, but this time having interrogated the manifestos and getting parties to engage with young people. We did the mock election. The results changed substantially because this time there was you knew the people. You had now started to look at the manifestos. When we went back after the election, unlike yourselves, many of those people didn't even vote. Now, I'm not one that says if you don't vote, you don't have a voice. I think that's nonsense. 19 million South Africans didn't take part in the election. And that's one of the biggest issues around accountability. So you would have elected you would have elected the party now elects from its list, it puts people in parliament. Those people now choose the president selects his cabinet. But in parliament, there is another big thing that happens, is parliament sets up various portfolio committees, and prior to those portfolio committees meeting, the party caucus will meet. And let me tell you, from having been a public representative in the city of Joburg, when the party caucus takes a decision, you are not at liberty to deviate. That is actually the most powerful institution there. So it doesn't matter what you say or do. That is how Nkandla, HIV/AIDS, and a whole range of things went through the process of parliament without people then being able to move away. So I'm saying, the point I'm getting to is that our electoral system doesn't actually encourage citizen accountability, because you don't know who your representatives really are. You wouldn't know where to find them. Many parties have what they call constituency officers. They've had them from 1994. I think in the first 5 years, they were a bit more active. In the last 10 years, I can tell you from my own experience, you can go there and you won't find a soul in the majority of them, unless it's a really hard-working parliamentarian. But that's because they see it as a civic responsibility, not because they have a sense of accountability to the voters or any constituency. Voters in a municipality will vote for a ward councillor. Now, ordinarily, you would think that if you're not happy with the ward councillor, you can do something to get rid of that ward councillor. It doesn't exist. You can have 90% of the people on the voters' roll sign a petition. You cannot get rid of that councillor. If the party doesn't like the councillor, they can ask him or her to resign. If he refuses, he or she can stay on as an independent. Now, you contrast this with a number of other places across the world where there are countermeasures to these kinds of systems, where at a local level, certain amounts of votes would then trigger an investigation into the suitability of that person to hold office, and therefore to listen to citizens. at least for a councillor. For a member of parliament, there is absolutely nothing you can do other than protest and do whatever you want to. So we have now taken part in an election, but our ability to hold those directly to account is minimal. Parliament in the last week would have dealt with 25 budget votes in the shortest space possible. Many of those parliamentarians would not have had the time to even go through it. As people outside of parliament, you have no clue what is in the budget. And that's the second issue I want to come to, is budget transparency, budget availability. So we're very focused on the budget speech and the budget that then gets approved by different line departments and gets allocated. What you don't have in South Africa is transparency about how that money then gets utilized. I mean, one of the most simple things to do to perhaps improve on accountability, every department gets monthly management reports. Every head of department, every MEC will get it. Every treasury in the province and national will get it. That information is not public. Without that information, we actually don't know what things are being spent on until somebody somewhere finds some information and gets that leaks out. And when you don't monitor the expenditure, when that isn't available, it's difficult. But the capacity of civil society to actually monitor this kind of task for hundreds of state entities and departments and so forth is virtually impossible. There are different groups who try to do this, but it is hugely impossible. So 2 weeks, about a month ago, in the area where our office is, a person who was previously a member of the legislature, an MEC, very upset about the state of the post office. He's been so for the last few years. It's just dirty, full of feces. It's just the most horrible sight. And they come to us and they say, well, can your young people help to clean up? And the young people say, okay. But the day after we clean up, what happens? So we go to the Postmaster General. Can you give us your budget? I said, no, I can't, because I don't have my budget. Who's responsible for cleaning the place? Not me. My job stops inside of the post office. The area outside of it, between the fence and the entrance, is not my business. Whose responsibility? I don't know. So young people do two things. They clean up, but they mount a huge social media campaign tagging the new minister. She's highly embarrassed. The next day then sends out teams to start doing the cleanup operations. But up until now, who should be accountable, we don't know. For what? We know it's for the cleaning and the provision of those services. How should they be accountable? Again, we don't know. And to whom should they be accountable? Obviously, it's to the users of those places. But the mechanisms to deal with the information deficit in terms of who exactly is responsible, where does the budget reside, who has the contracts to do all of this, becomes a huge problem. Now, this is just one post office. Can you imagine the scale across if we have to have this kind of approach towards accountability? In the UK, there's a wonderful center called the Center for Public Scrutiny. That center basically works with public representatives and community organizations to teach them the art of public scrutiny. UK local government might have changed now, but by 2001, 2002, powerful examples of using scrutiny to then hold people to account. But also in those municipalities, the difference there was that if you were in opposition, you had the leeway to say to the executive, hold on your decision. We want to table an alternative. And that alternative would have been resources providing the alternative would have come from the city itself. People would bring in their own experts, table those kinds of alternatives, and those get debated by the full council. not in terms of what happens here. So there are wonderful practical ways of accountability, um, but beyond elections, and that's really the point that I want to get to. Empowering accountability to do the kind of work on the scale that is required is just huge. What we are doing, and I think Corruption Watch has been the forefront of that kind of work, scratches the surface. So we get some cases, we make a big noise out of it, as David says, you create the ripples, and you hope that this will get the necessary attention. But it drains us, it drains our resources, and it comes back to ultimately re-looking at our electoral systems, re-looking at how we engage with people whom we entrust into office, and what are the simple things we can do to begin at a very local level, start building those centers of accountability.
Thanks, Sean. So up to this point, we've been focusing largely on public sector accountability, and I'd like to just go to David one last time to speak about private sector accountability, specifically in his former life as the chair of the competition tribunal. David, can you speak to maybe one flagship case that illustrates for us um, the uh, the extent to which monopolization of the market, etc., can get to? And I think, if I recall correctly, one of the big cases formally, I'm not sure if you were chair at the time, was the bread case, right? The big bread monopoly case, because I think that might illustrate very clearly the impact of that kind of corruption on the populace, on citizens in particular, and poor citizens specifically. Thank you.
Yeah, Mohammed mentioned that I'd written this book called Thieves at the Dinner Table, and the title of the book actually comes. The title of the book actually comes from the hearings into the bread cartel case, where communities came to give evidence of the impact of the bread cartel on the lives of ordinary people, and the representative of the Black Sash who came there said the bread companies. This was Tiger Brands at the time. The bread companies are like thieves at the dinner table, and it's that statement that became the title for the book. And indeed, it is the case that for a whole variety of reasons, South Africa has an unusually high degree of cartels. Cartel being a situation where companies, instead of competing with each other, who can sell the best quality product for the lowest price, collude with each other, conspire with each other to fix the price and to fix often the quality of the product that they deliver, and keep the prices high and very often the quality low. So this is, this was a preeminent area of activity for the competition authorities, but there are also other areas of activity for competition authorities. And so we regulate the mergers of two large companies in order to try and prevent the monopolization of the industry or the rise of dominant firms within a particular industry. And the competition authorities also monitor the conduct of dominant firms. And many of the dominant firms that we monitor the conduct of, you'll hear their names. The cases that we dealt with in my time at the competition authority: South African Airways, Sasol, ISCOR. Many of these were former state-owned enterprises who were privatized and who were dominant in their market because previously they had been the only ones in the market. And the competition authorities monitor their conduct. And, interestingly, to some extent faced with the same problems that civil society organizations have faced, that the resources for dealing with these are much smaller than the scale of the problem. But there, at least, you have the ability to make law and to punish those who are engaged in breaking the law. Um, and so this can act, if you like, as a deterrent to others who you have not got around to prosecuting because you didn't have the resources to do so, and it acts as a deterrent in the same way that law enforcement always acts as a deterrent. And it was a successful institution. I often measure the success of the competition authorities in that although we have a very big, as I've said, cartel problem in South Africa, in the 25,000 reports that we've never received one report of price fixing. And the reason for that, and corruption watch, and the reason for that is not that there is no price fixing, but that there is an efficient, relatively efficient organization, law enforcement organization, that you can go to punish a price fixer. People don't feel the same way about the Hawks and the NPA and whatever, so they come to us um, and organizations like us. But in the competition authorities, you do have a public organization that is capable of punishing transgressors, and so they do go to them. But I often say about the competition authorities when people ask me to gauge whether they have been successful or not. I always think that the most successful part of the competition authorities was for the first time it said to businesses, you are accountable to the rule of law, even for those activities that you thought were decisions that belonged to you and you alone. I'll never forget the first time we had to judge a merger. We had these two, it was a merger between the JD Group, the furniture group, and Ellering's, the other furniture group, two largest furniture groups in the country. There were these two great entrepreneurs, Eric Ellerin and David Sussman, sitting before us, and they were being told that we, who didn't know a thing about furniture as far as they were concerned, except what it did, or about business for that matter, were the ones who were going to be deciding whether they could merge or not. And it wasn't only a great sense of personal power, I might add. It was like seeing them, you know, your decisions have impact on the community and on the society. And so they have got to be subject to the rule of law. And I think that was the great contribution of the competition authorities. It said to big business that you are not laws unto yourself. There is a law that regulates your activity. And so that's what we did in the competition authorities. And it was interesting work. But I do want to say about our own work with now in Corruption Watch, with and against the private sector. We get asked once a week, at least every radio call-in show that we engage in, why are you only interested in the public sector and not in the private sector? And my answer to that is, firstly, it's not true. If you spoke to groups like McKinsey or Cash Paymaster Services or KPMG, they would ask us, why are you only interested in the private sector, not the public sector? So it's not true. It's also the case that most corruption occurs at the interface between the public and the private. Whether it's a traffic cop and a driver, or whether it's a minister and a big company that wants a government decision in its favor, it's at that interface between the public and the private that corruption occurs. But if you want to ask me why we are seen to be making more fuss about the public sector than the private sector, my answer to that is it's because the public sector belongs to us. It's ours. We elected representatives who appointed public officials precisely in order to regulate powerful private interests like the private business sector. And it's when they get into bed, it's when the public sector gets into bed with the private sector, which is what corruption is, rather than regulates them, that you have a problem. And we can more easily hold accountable because we vote. Ineffective as Shan describes it, and I agree with him, because we vote, because we pay taxes every time we go and buy something, we have a greater hold over the public sector than we do over the private sector. But we need to fight to make the private sector accountable to us, accountable to the law, and accountable to government. And so, we've engaged in many cases against private sector interests precisely in order to enforce this notion that you are not above the law. And some of big names like McKinsey, like KPMG, that have been caught with their hands in the till have been punished as a result of it. I mean, does it deter them? Well, unfortunately, and we found this in the competition authority as well, you could impose fines in with a number of noughts that none of us in this room could ever have dreamt of. We impose fines of hundreds of millions of rands. Um, uh, McKinsey pays back. McKinsey gets caught stealing money from Eskom, and it pays back 900 million rand of the fee that it earned. What rubbish is this? They think that they've done that. They think that they're all righteous for doing that. I mean, when did you hear of somebody stealing a loaf of bread, gouging out the middle of the bread, getting caught, and then saying, "Well, okay, I'll return the crust to you. That's fine. Now we're quits." He goes to jail for that. And unfortunately, where the punishment is only a fine, and it was proved to be the case across the world in the competition authorities, the only effective deterrent is jail. I mean, that's why the US have been so good at deterring cartel conduct, because they put people in jail. And because of the failures of the NPA and the Hawks and some of the limitation of the legislation, we can't put people in jail in this country. And the interesting thing about that is that when you want to understand state capture, understand it from the day the Scorpions got disbanded, from the day Zuma, 2 weeks into his presidency, appointed Richard Mdluli to head crime intelligence, when he appointed a new head of the National Prosecuting Authority. The first institutions that were captured were the criminal justice authorities. And once he had achieved that, all bets were off, because they knew that they could engage in corruption, and he could engage in corruption with impunity, because there was no one to to punish him. And as I say, in the case of these sorts of crimes, the only effective punishment is jail time.
Thanks, David. Sean, accountability isn't limited to corruption, of course. And I'd like you to speak to particularly the H&M case, where the AKF was instrumental in holding H&M accountable for its advertising, which included depicting a black child as a monkey in a T-shirt that he was wearing. And the process that the AKF went through in holding H&M accountable and forcing it to change its global processes related to that. Thank you.
No, thank you. But let me say at the outset that when H&M first opened in South Africa is when they made their very first kinds of. We got an indication that something was wrong. The week when they opened their first stores, all of the models and so forth that they hired were all white. And when questioned, they were simply saying, well, this represents the kind of best, the virtuous values that we want to uphold, or something to that effect. Yeah, but wait, I'm coming to the rest of it. It's actually a good story. And then when this hoodie thing broke, we wrote to the global office, and we got a kind of bland response. We're aware of the thing, we'll deal with it, don't worry. We reached out to the local office, wanted an immediate meeting. They said, look, we'll come back to you. And we then said, well, we now need to go to phase 2. We had planned on to then go and demonstrate at their shops on the Monday. On that Saturday, before we were going to do it, the EFF went. But I say this, and I'll say this anyway, that had the EFF not done what they did, not that we agree with the full range of their tactics, I don't think H&M would have been open to then talking to anybody. When they were faced with this pressure, they then reached out to us to say, well, let's start talking.
fresh or whatever. But we are quite big on social media. Our website is a very heavily trafficked website. So our website is not simply a website that provides information about ourselves. It's like a news website. I think there's something of the order of about 30 new posts every week on the website. So it's a news website. It's and we use the mainstream and community media there. For example, on the Zondo Commission at the moment, we have a writer permanently assigned to the Zondo Commission who is providing daily copy, mostly aimed at community news platforms and small regional platforms who can't afford to send reporters to the Zondo Commission every day. So media is a big deal for us. And you'll see it, and maybe it's something that we could talk about, often said, that the three sets of organizations that ended up defeating state capture, the Zuma administration, the civil society organizations, the media, and the courts. And it's interesting to contemplate what the media is in South Africa, where it's going to, who is going to capture the media, and who has captured the media. But they have been a very important constituency. So that's, but sorry, to just say finally, we are more and more going out to communities to engage. It's becoming a more and more important part of our activity, that sort of direct interface. And we're doing a lot of work around communities and policing. Maybe there's time after about 10 years that refers to what Shan said about transparency, about this campaign that we're involved in with policing, which is very much more direct communication.
Okay, shall we take a round of questions from the center? I have Karuna, I have Vakira, I have Buti, Zimkita, Tabajo, and Lucanio. I think we'll just take the whole set in one go rather than having to come back. Walid, can you maybe give the microphone to Zakra? Zakra, you can start and then pass it over
Morning.
through.
I just have about two questions for Corruption Watch and just one for Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. So my first question for Corruption Watch actually goes back to what Tabo was asking. So many times you see that when organizations are funded by private companies, um, they actually have to play. They usually play out the agendas of those private companies. Now, I see that Corruption Watch is actually funded by companies like Anglo Gold and Oppenheimer, and those companies alike, um, which at the end of the day sometimes consequentially can lead to propaganda, right? How do you, as an organization, avoid that propaganda for starters, and avoid playing out agendas of private companies that, let's be honest, as much as we can say they are philanthropists, at the end of the day, do have their own agendas? The second question I want to ask is with regards to students at university and why Corruption Watch hasn't necessarily um, mobilized the radical youth that you find on campuses from the various organizations, be it political or not. Um, and if you would like to, or if you think it would be a good idea to mobilize the youth, how would you how would you do that, considering the structure of the organization? Then the question I have for AKF is, obviously we know that social justice doesn't only work within our own communities, but communities outside of us. And I want to know, what is the relationship between AKF and BDS? Because I know there's a lot of problems around the relationships with organizations such as AKF with organizations such as BDS.
Oh, thank you very much. I have like one question of the AKF Foundation was like most of the question they've like, asked about the funding with regards to the watch crime, watch corruption. Yes, thank you. Corruption watch, watch. You have to interchange. It's fine. So with AKF. Well, when the Guptas landed on the like South African air base, you guys were very active and vocal about that issue. And also when our like previous former president Jacob Zuma was involved with the Guptas, you guys were also involved and vocal about him. And also you have also briefed us how the late Kathrada was like saying he doesn't want him to speak in his funeral and stuff. But then surprisingly, now that Mr. Pravin Gordhan he lied in Parliament about meeting the Guptas, you guys haven't released any statement, and also you are protecting him. So my question is, like as a student, now I start to question whether does discrimination or any racial issues exist within the organization. Thank you.
Good morning. My question is more philosophical and relates to your experience as civil society actors. Why do ethical goods and services, transparency and accountability cost more?
I've got three questions. The first is, did President Thabo then deliberately suppress civil society, the voice of civil society? The second is the fines that are charged, the penalties for collusion or price fixing. Where exactly does that money go to? And thirdly, whistleblowers have a really hard time. What is Corruption Watch doing about supporting whistleblowers, and especially educating them in terms of the what is that called, the Protected Disclosures Act? I really think that is something Corruption Watch should be doing, in terms of educating people, linking it to the Protected Disclosures Act, and in terms of the compliance to that, as well as supporting them, their activism, and yeah, and we can take our lessons from cases that have come before court.
Okay, I think we'll answer those and then go to the next round. The centrists are always very vocal in this room for some reason.
It's odd now, yeah. I mean, on the first question about philanthropies and business interests, I mean, this may seem like a very thin distinction to you, but there are very few, if any, donations we've got directly from businesses. They're all from foundations connected to businesses, and some are more actively connected than others. But something like the Chairman's Fund of the Anglo American Corporation has existed as an independent, autonomous institution, in fact, run by an old civil society activist for forever. Um, what does one do about something like the Ford Foundation or the Open Society Foundation? These are all, you know, business connected, ultimately in their origins, derived from private wealth, but are amongst the foremost organizations promoting social justice, which is not to say that we agree with them all the time on everything that they do and everything that they fund, but they're not it's not George Soros's hedge fund or the Ford Motor Corporation that is donating the money. They are foundations that are relatively autonomous, some of which have no family interests involved in anymore, some of which do have family interests involved in it. We also do a due diligence on anybody who donates money to us. But it sometimes can create awkward questions. I remember the one big grant that we've gotten from business was when we were doing a big campaign around the public protector. Business Leadership South Africa asked, approved, we presented to them, and they liked the campaign, and they called on their members to to provide us with donations for an aspect of the campaign. And those often came directly from businesses. And I remember, and we wanted, we never hide where our funding comes from. Apart from the fact that that's dangerous, we want, particularly from businesses, we want them to say that they are working together with us. This problem of corruption, just like the problem of apartheid, is too big for any of us to deal with on our own. And we have to be willing to forge alliances with organizations that may not be our natural allies. I've always thought that the art of politics is not being able to work with those who you agree with. It's being able to work with those who you don't always agree with. But so companies donated money to us, and I remember when we suddenly discovered that one of the companies that was maybe going to be donating money to us was Lonman. At the time of the Marikana, now we wouldn't have taken that money. But how do you distinguish between, as I think the one question was asked, an ethical business and not an ethical business? Would you take from a business that makes cigarettes or is involved in the armaments industry or whatever? I don't always know the answer to that question. I will say, and this might seem like a very weak excuse, where else do we get money from? You know, where else do we get money from? We can't. Can we take money from the state? I don't know. Can we take money from business? I'm not sure. We can take money from the public, but they don't often give very much money. So it's a really difficult conundrum because we, in common with most other civil society organizations, are incredibly resource constrained. So it's a challenge and something that we have to worry about every day. All I know is that about 60% of my work is in fundraising. I'm afraid to say, because it's the least exciting part of the work. The youth mobilization thing, we have periodically tried to organize on campuses. Not very successfully, and I don't really understand why. We've worked with the Law Students for Social Justice, that organization we work with quite a lot, more so in the past than we do now. We had a very successful youth focus group drawn sort of randomly from about 50 young people across the country, sort of young leaders, I think. And again, that sort of just, as these things often do, sort of fell by the wayside. But for the year or two in which it ran, it was a very successful initiative for us. And it really inspired and drove our schools campaign a lot. So it's something we would like to reproduce again. And I'd love to know your thinking on how we can engage with the campuses in particular, because it would be very important. There are particular programs or particular forms of corruption that affect the youth more disproportionately than older people. In a report from Transparency International that will be released tomorrow, that includes a survey in South Africa, says that the youth are much more likely to pay bribes than older people. It's not clear whether that's because they're more vulnerable or because they're asked more often or the older people refuse or whatever. But it's a very important constituency for us to engage with.
Karuna, you wanted to just say something about it before David goes on?
If we can start something, I mean, it would be through the WCCO. We could actually work with Corruption Watch and get students who are interested in learning more or kind of putting out the word amongst their peers.
I would love to. I mean, our staff complement is certainly much more attuned to you than they are to me, I might add, in generational terms. So I would really welcome that.
I challenge you, Takira. You raised that question, right? I challenge you to get this started through WCCO.
Yes.
So we have a massive issue on campus, and I'm speaking from a Wits perspective, obviously. But our fees must fall leaders are still in jail, and my thing is, and that's mainly why I asked you the question. So yes, Corona, you're right, we can get it started through WCCO, but if you want to mobilize the youth, especially the radical youth that we have on our campuses, then we need to start by asking questions about why are we not having our leaders released from jail? Why are we the only ones standing outside courts when these leaders are standing in their court cases? And that's a bit problematic for me, and it's where I would probably want to see an organization such as yourself at.
I didn't understand the question about ethical goods and services. I mean,
So the question was, why does ethical goods and services cost more? So
So
when you're buying clothing or food or whatever from businesses that try to hold themselves to higher levels of
yeah.
ethics, why would those kind of goods cost more?
if I could just elaborate on the point, of course, that's a good example. If you want something that's environmentally friendly or sustainably produced, obviously it costs more. But even within um, your work as Corruption Watch, um, you the reason why you exist is because things are not being done the ethical or correct way. And actually, now we need to allocate more funding in order to make transparency and accountability possible. Whereas we have policies in place, which should be what hold the system together. But now we have to allocate more funding, for a process which has already been sort of institutionalized or put into policy. We have to put more money and more effort into having ethical behavior. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe Shad can help me with this. I think, greater transparency, big behavior change programs, they're costly. I mean, particularly big behavior change programs. I firmly believe they would pay for themselves thousands of times over. And so you know, corruption, for example, is partly about behavior change. There's no question about it. I mean, a massive behavior change program is a very challenging and very resource intensive thing, but it can be very successful. It was very successful, for example, in the HIV/AIDS programs. It's slightly easier thing to focus on than corruption. But if we were to get involved as Soul City and organizations like that at the time did in making movies and massive advertising campaigns, I mean, you're talking about sums of money that are way out of our reach, but that would, I think, really pay for themselves as they did in the HIV/AIDS case. But you've got to get those with the money to part with their money, uh, which is not easy. So I don't know if that answers the question at all, but yes, I don't think in the end it would be costly to introduce greater transparency. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, I remember in once in the budget about 3 years ago, it was in fact Pravin Gordon's budget, when they mentioned that they were going to be, he said in the budget that they were going to be putting up sort of posters, banners, boards at every public construction site in the country saying how many houses are supposed to be built here, what is their cost, who's the contractor, who is the government official in charge of this, and here is his or her telephone number. I thought that was the most exciting thing in the budget. And I have to say, when I saw him a week later and said that was a really good line in the budget, he hadn't even remembered that it was there, you know, and it would cost nothing. It would cost absolutely nothing, but it would be a most effective way of getting communities themselves to see whether the money that was allocated to the community is being spent on them as it was intended to be, or it isn't. And it wouldn't cost much, quite frankly, at all. So I don't think that it's necessarily expensive to introduce transparency, and the returns are considerable. I mean, did Tabo suppress civil society? I mean, should argue that I think every government to a greater or lesser degree, suppresses civil society. And, Thabo was not particularly friendly to civil society, you know, um, because I really think, government is as good as its citizens are active. And no government enjoys being held to account. I mean, some are obviously more allergic to it than others, like the Zuma administration. But I think civil society always has to exist in a somewhat tense relationship to government. Sometimes that tension can be more constructive than others, but if the tension disappears, then the civil society will disappear. There's no question about that. But our constitution protects us against some of the stuff that has been done in places like India, Russia, other places in which civil society has been really repressed. And the first place they start usually is by making sure that those who fund civil society, like institutions like the Ford Foundation or the Open Society Foundation, are not allowed to function in the country. Where do the penalties go to? They either go to the General Revenue Fund, which is just, all the money that buys the blue lights, doesn't buy the houses, whatever, it just goes into the General Revenue Fund. In the case of corruption work, there's an account called the Criminal Asset Recovery Account, which is where some of the money that is seized, the assets that are seized from corrupt uh, uh, individuals or institutions go to. The fund has about 300 million rand in it, and we've been trying to get access to that fund because we've put a fair amount of money into it already, but we just can't find out who's supposed to manage that fund in government. But but we should get it. Um, and supporting whistleblowers, I mean, this is a big question, and I agree with you, a very important one. And you may not believe it, but our legislation to protect whistleblowers is probably almost as good as it gets. And the way to protect whistleblowers is to make heroes of them, is for society to celebrate them. I mean, whistleblowers are still often treated as impimpies rather than as heroes. And the best protection that they can have is to be treated by the communities as the heroes that they are. But I'll say this finally, there's one complicated thing about whistleblowers that we're all going to have to learn, and we learned it in the competition tribunal very quickly, is that the idealized whistleblower is the citizen hero that comes forward with critical information and his life is threatened. That's a nice thing to believe, and it's the case with some. The most valuable whistleblowers often are people like Angelo Agrisi, who no, but who were there when the brown envelope passed, and who are the ones who can put somebody in jail. And what you have to learn, it was the same in the price fixing cases, is that we're gonna have to hold our noses and see many of those people get off scot free because they have ratted on more important fish even than they are. But those are going to be often the most valuable whistleblowers that in the sense of actually getting people to jail. So it's a complicated question.
And of course, revenge is a powerful motive, even more powerful than values at times,
Exactly, and fear.
and fear.
Yeah.
So, Shan, a few questions for you in that round as well.
Let me just also come to the university students thing. It's not the easiest of places to set up societies and clubs, simply because of the turnover of students, their study priorities, the competition primarily with one is faith-based the student formations have grown prolifically, and then the political societies. And if you don't, not in either of the two, it's difficult to operate. So we tried societies and clubs at universities, it was just you need full-time organizers to go onto those campuses to do that kind of work. And in the end, it was just not worth our while to continue doing it, which is why we're now going into communities to set up these clubs, because there is space for real work by those young people. We don't have any acrimonious relationship with BDS. I'm not sure where that would come from. We, in my view, BDS is perhaps the most effective Palestinian solidarity organization in this country. I am worried about the kind of fractious nature of that solidarity work, and sometimes the tendency, not necessarily by BDS, but I think many others, who can't draw the lines between solidarity work and wanting to determine the agenda for the Palestinians themselves. Our work in Palestinian solidarity is a small issue, just of political prisoners. And that comes from Kathrada himself having gone to Palestine, got the huge shock of his life when he met prisoners who were there for more than 27 years in jail, some 33 years. Initiated a global campaign for around one prisoner, Marwan Barghouti, and that became a global campaign. But the suppression of the campaign coordinators in Ramallah has meant that it has now become ineffective. We're hoping to revitalize that in the course of the year. So around that issue, we will work with BDS and whoever else, but it is not the core of our work. I have huge respect for the people who have been doing the work for BDS. Yeah, so the Pravin Gordhan issue, I thought that would come up. So the common narrative is that he lied to Parliament. But go and read the stuff. What PG had said at Zondo was that he can't recollect. Firstly, he didn't go to the Gupta compound. He's never been to Saxon World. Unlike a huge number of others who are behind driving this kind of claim. He met Ambani, who was looking to buy a stake in MTN. And in the meeting, according to him, reminded by his former DG, was one of the Guptas. But his meeting was with Ambani. He then, on his own, declares this, comes and rectifies his own information to Parliament, and now it's being said that he lied. So you can take the truth and stretch it. Pravin, our support for Pravin goes back to the time that he was going to be, 2015, 2016, when he was going to appear in court, when they were going to be charged around the rogue units and all of those things. Kathrada himself had said to us that he wanted to be with Pravin and would walk with him into court because he didn't doubt his innocence on any, or he didn't doubt that he was innocent on any of those charges. So I would suggest to you, go and look at the ones who are making these claims, go and look at the evidence, and ask yourself why. Why is somebody who stopped the nuclear deal in its tracks, stopped the Gupta's banks from basically being functioning, by now somebody who wanted to ensure that they were functioning, who's now chairing a parliamentary portfolio committee, who was the head of the Estina projects and so forth, who then goes on to almost lie and claim that he's got the right to set up an interministerial committee to force banks to keep the Gupta's bank accounts opened. So here's somebody who stood up to those things. Now the latest thing is that he didn't go to university, didn't get his degree and so forth. Then there was a Canadian bank account, which none of it has in fact been proved. So his degree, he now has to go and show that he has a pharmacy degree. Somebody who was a practicing pharmacist, could not have practiced his pharmacy in a state hospital without having had the required degrees. Go and look at, and I thought that the public protector, the deputy public protector would have been here, because this would have been a useful thing for them to clarify their own positions. And I'm confident that the reviews on these cases will create, I think, further pressure to question the competence of the public protector. So go and look at our other work. I mean, one of the key things we did was around Judge Mabel Jansen. And we were amongst the organizations who went to the hearings of the Chief Justice, called for a recusal because of the racist comments. Go and see our work on Vicky Momberg and on others there. So don't just look at, and for me it's province, not province kind of race. And the fact that his race can be used as an argument, I think simply begins to show the shallowness of thinking in terms of bringing race classification in and then saying because this is a Kathrada foundation, therefore it will find alignment with Pravin. Not the issue of state capture, which we have been consistent on. So look at consistency. You know, the H&M thing, when I went to Berlin, I got to understand the intricacies of ethical goods and services. Sweatshops is a big issue here. So you can produce stuff in Bangladesh and India and China and so forth at a fraction of the cost anywhere else, but under the most inhumane conditions. And I didn't know that in one factory, you'll have 5 or 6 different companies producing goods. So Nike and whoever else and different clothing manufacturers. And because of the weaknesses of trade unions in Bangladesh itself, the representatives of H&M from Turkey who are doing this work were saying that they wanted to raise the salaries of workers in their factories. But all of the other manufacturers based in the same factory were up in arms. And that was an intricacy that I really didn't understand. And there's now some global trade forums to try and sort those things out. But when you can produce things cheaper in China and so forth and import them into South Africa, decimate the textile industry here, buyers are going to go in that direction, which is why I think the president tried to say, well, I can wear a South African suit here. But 9 out of 10 South Africans are going to look for the cheaper option of that. And that's really the big issue around ethical stuff, is people don't think about ethics. It's the money. It's the same with the Woolworth, the plastic bags. You pay the tax, but the convenience of taking the thing is there. All of us are drinking mineral water here. Joburg water is as good as the stuff in the tap, in those bottles, but we won't do it. So that's the difficulty, is really internalizing the cost benefit of ethical goods. Suppression of civil society, I think, is something we've seen from 1994. You know, at the start of 1994, civic movements would occupy a particular space. The whole notion of community development forums became a huge issue as opposed to civic movements. Then you have councillors coming into elected office and a huge tension as to who now represents people. And that tension escalates in many, many different ways, up to a point where I think many civic movements and so forth basically disappear from the coalface of this country. And it's a very different kind of pressure that we've seen. The funding issue, we have not in 10 years taken a cent from government for any of our work because we couldn't go to the Zuma administration. We might rethink that now in certain areas of our work where that kind of alignment is possible. But generally funding, for at least for our foundation, will come without any conditions. And the bulk of our money really comes from individuals who contribute to debit orders and annual grants and sponsorships to the foundation. But where businesses do give us money, we would not accept any conditions. I must say, last year I did a roadshow to about 60 CEOs. Not a single one was prepared to fund us. One, they didn't like our board. They thought that the board that had Derek Hanekom, Khalima Motlant, and others was too one sided in terms of the political factions. Two, others didn't like our position on Palestine, thought that if we removed that from our portfolio of work, then they could consider us. And third is that many of them said tackling racism, strengthening democracy, and so forth is not part of their social responsibility areas. And those 60 meetings, basically nothing came out of it, which is why we then do an annual banquet. We used to do golf days, we do telethons, we do plays and film shows and all kinds of things to keep a foundation going that requires about 6 million a year.
Thanks, Sean. So we're going to take the last round of questions on the right, and I am aware that the back row, there were a few questions there. So let's go from my right-hand side, and we'll conclude in the back row. Please keep your questions to short and not to multiple questions, so that we can get through all of the questions before the end of our session. Thanks, Chizembe.
Fine. I'll stick to one question, but it's then for both of our panelists here. Thank you very much. One thing I'd like to know, where both of your organizations, what's your opinion on party funding? I know that was something that during this election cycle was quite a big issue, especially with the ANC almost maybe switching positions. Do you think that there should be a greater level of transparency in party funding? And should the IEC probably introduce some kind of funding cap on what party should spend on an election, and how much a limit there should be on what they receive from big government, big business, and how much they should be receiving from normal, ordinary donations? Thank you.
In terms of furthering non-racialism, I think that not enough has been done to undermine the sort of racial discourse and the psychological legacies of apartheid that have shaped how we conceptualize ourselves and how we think about our relationships with one another. I think this was revealed in the sort of racialization, or I suppose the as you mentioned, Sean, the racial discourse that emerged in the commentary on Praveen Gordhan, and we've seen it in other examples. So my question is, where do you foresee our current trajectory going if we don't take those active steps? And what steps do you think we should be taking to break down that racial discourse, or to at least think about it in different ways?
Good morning. My question is to both of you. I just want to know, do you have any form of evaluation that your civil society takes to see how that campaign or program is doing, and what are some of the criteria that you look at for whether it's successful or not? Thank you.
Good morning. My question is, good morning. So my question is directed to the rest of the panel. You see, one of the major contributor of corruption is capturing. So, us as youth, the future leaders of these countries, most of the time we are captured through university fees funding. and you find that one day I'll elevate to a higher public position and then be required to, let's say now the company that's funding me, it's company owned by a certain mafia in Stellenbosch. And then tomorrow when or in any other parts of the country, and then one day when I elevate to a higher position, I'll be required to sort of take orders from that kind of individual. So I just want your opinion regarding this matter of capturing, especially as a student, why in they capture us while we are still fertile. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question is short and it's for both institutions. I heard you guys talking about reaching out to the communities. Are you reaching out to communities in Joburg, or is it each and every community around South Africa? Because, for instance, corruption goes a long way. From where I come from, there are still sports facilities that are unfinished. There are still water supplies that are unfinished. Another thing is access to information. Some of the information that we get here, most of the people in marginalized outside areas, young people don't have such information. So, what is it that you are doing to reach out to the greater population? Thank you.
No, I was very excited with the party funding initiatives. I'd hoped it would have come into effect before the election. I think it's an area of work that we must now prioritize and understand the technicalities of how this is going to work. Um, because currently, if it goes above 100,000 rands, I forget what the limit is now, then you have to report it. And we need to understand what loopholes that creates. But I think my bigger issue is how these accounts are then going to be audited, whether the IEC has the capacity, and whether we are going to be able to draw links between the funding of parties and the awarding of tenders at all spheres of government. Because remember, you can accept money, and that money is accepted nationally, but the payback will come through a tender in Kuruman, and you know, it will require a huge machinery to be able to track and do all of that kind of work. But I think the first step is a very positive one. A lot more work will have to be done. The capacity, the backbone of the IEC to do what this act is possibly intending to do. But you've seen in America, they found loopholes around this. They individualize the contributions, they spread it out over a number of people so it's smaller, but it's one big amount. It comes from one person, distributed amongst others to then make the contributions and bypass the system. In one sense, I don't share the pessimism about racialization and the kind of racial hatred. And the elections for me was a key test for that. Parties that were ethnic, that were regional and so forth, didn't do all that well in this election. Not that that's a big indicator of how social relations, what kind of social relations people would want. I don't think we've yet got a grasp on an effective strategy for social cohesion building in this country. We don't also have a adequate plan to tackle racism, which is the bedrock of a lot of this. We took 15 years to finalize a national action plan, which South Africa committed to in 2001. Finally finished last year, Cabinet approved it. But if any of you read the National Action Plan to Combat Racism, thick document, probably 4 or 5 pages there only on what needs to be done and how it can be done. Very scant. But that kind of work we are hoping to complement with a civil society-led addendum to the National Action Plan on the kinds of things that can be done both at a structural, personal, cultural, all the different levels which racism, I think, manifests and takes root in this country. I'm also encouraged by the last 2 years, just societal rejection and mobilization, at least against public uh, racism that we've seen. I mean, Kathrada and others, you've seen just social sanction in a huge way. And that must be built. Achille Mbembe says that, that there must be no space for racists in this country. There are huge debates now about whether coming legislation on hate speech and so forth are effective measures. But those debates, all of us now need to get involved in. Um, so there's a lot. I think just to conclude, South Africa's own capacity to 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 to, to tackle racism is incredibly weak. The Department of Justice has, who are the lead department dealing with this, have 2 people dealing with it. Civil society structures, there's probably about 4 or 5 dedicated anti-racism organizations in South Africa as a whole. Now you contrast this anywhere else in the world, where there are people who specialize in different areas of tackling racism and building movements to tackle this. We are starting in that direction, to at least build a national network and very simple tools of a racism reporting app is something that we have now launched and beginning to roll out nationally. And partners around that, the Human Rights Commission and a whole lot of others, to start looking at the stuff that's reported through and how to then take action on those things, is to also test the efficacy of the equality courts and to strengthen those mechanisms to start dealing with it. But I don't think legal action and criminalization ultimately will eradicate the problem. The fundamental basis for racism in this country, the inequality, the skewed economy and so forth, would need to be dealt with, as well as new thinkings around culture and bridging divides and so forth will need to be done. How we evaluate our work is difficult to measure whether racism is disappearing or not. If we go according to the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation's annual barometer, we can use that as a tracking mechanism. But you take their reports and you look at the Institute for Race Relations, it's just 2 different reports. The IRR will say racism is not a problem in this country. Justice and Reconciliation will have a very different, so it depends on methodologies. We can now begin to track instances of reported racism to the foundation that we can use as a measure. Youth development is a very simple indicator for us. 10 years, we want 100 youth clubs across this country. That 10 a year. So by the time we get to Kathrada centenary in 2029, we want to have that footprint across the country. We've got other indicators in terms of numbers of publications and numbers of people reached and so forth. Overall societal impact of all of this work, I don't think we have mechanisms to deal with it at this point in time. Well, I mean, it goes to, I don't think it's necessarily only students who get bursaries through companies. And maybe I've been too long out of university, but I would assume companies will give money to the universities who then begin to do that. But it also depends on your own sense of ethics. You can get a state-funded bursary and still be a crook. So it's not going to go either way. If you're in a public sector job and that company calls for a favor, you should have no sense of obligation because legally they have no hold over you. If you do feel a sense of obligation, it says something about your own level of ethics and ability to withstand that kind of pressure. I'm not underplaying it because I think the overall weakness in the public sector, if you take Life Esidimeni, officials were not able to say to that MEC, we're not going to do this thing. They were not able to stand up to the pressure. And because I worked with her, I know what they went through. I know exactly what they went through. But I was able to stand up to her and say, you can't do X, Y, and Z. For whatever reason, these individuals didn't have the kind of sense of ethics and the strength of character to say no and know that their jobs were going to be on the line if they were going to do that, and to take it further. So one of the first things we did after Isidimeni and all of that, the premier was on our board. We said to him, get to meet all public servants and say to them in Gauteng that if you come under this pressure, you phone me directly. I don't know whether he has or hasn't done that, but certainly individuals need to know that they don't have to accede to that kind of pressure. But that's also a classic case of accountability and a lack of accountability. Um, as I said, outreach for us, we do work currently in 10 communities in the south of Joburg, very structured work, but we do outreach work in different parts of the country on different areas of work. But not necessarily on the issues that you're talking of. For me, I think what you are raising is really a good case to say, well, if you're aware of this, as coming out of this cause, what are you going to do?
Just take a few of the questions. You know, the party funding thing. You know, the political parties across the board in South Africa, the one thing that they've been able to agree on is that they didn't want their funding regulated. And then, to my surprise, you know, at the end of last year, suddenly the ANC got on board with the party funding thing, and they pushed some legislation, not bad legislation, through Parliament more quickly than I've ever known any other legislation to be pushed through Parliament. And quite frankly, I think it's because they wanted to know who was funding all the litigation that the EFF and the DA were engaging in. Because I see now the ANC are starting to renege on that and starting to say, well, you know, it was difficult to raise funding, and so I think we've still got a fight coming over the party funding thing. But I think it's absolutely critical that party funding be regulated, and I think it's also important, although I wouldn't know how to do it, that party spending gets regulated as well. In fact, in general, you know, I think we have to start thinking about regulating political parties more closely. I mean, you know, look across the world. Look at what's going on in Britain. Look at the United States. In France, the only way the president could be elected was by not being a member of a political party. Political parties are being severely discredited and are dysfunctional across the world. And I think we need to start thinking very creatively about how to regulate them, because I can't think of a system, a democratic system, that works without political parties. But I also can't think of one that will survive if political parties continue along the trajectory that they're continuing at the moment. So I think this is going to be a big question for the next many years, is both the funding, the expenditure, but general regulation of political parties. You know, on the evaluation issue, I mean, we actually have a monitoring and evaluation officer who works in Corruption Watch. So important is it to us? And it's very challenging. You know, most of the monitoring and evaluation industry is like in the healthcare sector. So you say, I'm going to administer 100,000 vaccinations. This is what the situation was before the vaccinations were administered. This is what they were after the vaccinations were administered. And it's quite an easy task. It's much more difficult in the case of social justice organizations where you rely on anecdotes. You know, when you think that we started in 2012, you think what corruption was like in 2019, you'd have to say we failed dismally. But I'd like to know. But on the other hand, what would it have been if the civil society organizations weren't there fighting corruption? It could have been a hell of a lot worse. Was it because we paid so much public attention to corruption that people felt freer to speak about it and report about it? So these are incredibly difficult monitoring and evaluation exercises to do, and they rely on anecdotes and qualitative measures rather than quantitative measures. But it's very challenging field. But completely critical. We don't want to spend 1 cent on something that is not succeeding, and that's why we need monitoring and evaluation of our work done. But it's quite difficult. Yeah, I mean, on the capturing of students through bursaries, if a funder says to you, "I'll give you a bursary, but after you've graduated, you have to come and work in my company for a year," I don't consider that an unacceptable uh, requirement. I mean, provided you're not, going to be working in something completely unethical, but then you wouldn't have accepted the funding from that person in the first place. If the funder says to you, "I'll give you this bursary, but you're not allowed to take part in student politics of any sort," and defines it in some way, well, I'd be less comfortable about taking that sort of funding. And so I think it involves being alert and being pragmatic, um, and not agreeing to stuff that you don't want, that you feel would compromise you. So, and then on the sort of outreach stuff, the community outreach stuff, we only have an office in Johannesburg, but we do engage across the country. So our policing work, for example, was focused very heavily on the Cape Flats. Even though there's plenty to focus on in Gauteng, we just somehow got involved with the Cape Flats, where I'm sure most of you know about what the justice, law enforcement situation is in, in that part of the country. One of our biggest programs at the moment, which interestingly is funded by the Anglo-American, partly funded by the Anglo-American Foundation, is on mining royalties in some of the most depressed communities of the country who are owed billions of rands. Not only, and the money is often mostly not stolen by the companies, it's stolen by provincial authorities and traditional authorities, quite honestly. But I think it's in many ways the biggest untold corruption story in the country. So we do try to reach out to other communities. And one of the reasons why we have such a strong focus on working with community media is to be able to engage with communities that are outside of the big metropolitan areas. But undoubtedly, our profile is probably highest in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, and it's a struggle to get out to the other communities. But I find that when we do go, that they are very, very receptive and really do want to work with us. We've done quite a bit of work in the Northern Cape, for example, and the communities are very, very responsive to the work that we do.
Okay, so we at the latter end of the session. Sean's asked for an opportunity to ask questions of you. So we'll allow Sean and David to ask questions of you in terms of whatever it is that they'd like to speak about in terms of the topic, and then we'll move on to concluding remarks. Carolyn, you have a question?
Morning. Yes, one last question. So I'd like to ask Corruption Watch, how what do you guys do, or rather, you guys say, um, you're about combating corruption, right? So my question is, we have people in government who we know very well that they've participated in several corruption acts and they are still in government. For example, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say out name, but let me just risk it. Um, in 2011, 2012, somewhere around there, the premier of Limpopo, Castle Matale, banned money which he looted. And from him being the premier, he was then moved to being a member of the parliament. And he's currently the deputy minister of police, if I'm not mistaken. So,
what do you guys do about such things? What is your role in such? Because I mean, you can't burn money and then come and arrest people who steal money. It doesn't make sense to me. So I want to know your role in such things. Thank you very much.
You know, I mean, it's a, you know, on one hand an obvious question, on the other hand it's a difficult question because, you know, I think, and you may disagree with me, that in the change from the Zuma administration to the Ramaphosa administration, that was it's important not to exaggerate the extent of the change because things don't change just with one leader changing. But it's also important not to understate the significance of the change. And so, from a very adversarial relationship with government, we are now, if you like, the possibilities are open for a more constructive relationship with government, where we can start talking about issues of transparency and those sorts of things. But at the same time, you've got to retain the degree of independence from government and from political parties that characterized you in the more adversarial stages. If you ask me, the most disappointing thing that has happened since the Ramaphosa administration was elected was in the or was or attained power when Zuma was removed is in the ANC parliamentary list. I mean, I nearly died when I saw the ANC parliamentary list, and when I saw that all those crooks, every single one of them, is a chair of an important portfolio committee. I'm telling you, Castle Matale is small fry compared to Supramau Mapelo, who destroyed the Northwest, compared to Faith Mutambi, compared to, um, I mean, Bongo, who bribed a parliamentary official while he was in Parliament, now gets to be the chair of a parliamentary portfolio committee. And you've got to retain the independence to say, yes, we'll work with you, but we will not work with these people. We'll continue to oppose them as aggressively as we've ever opposed them before. And that's what I say about the regulation of political parties. Is there a way of regulating who you can insult the parliament with? You know, and I'm not sure if there is. I mean, in an ideal world, you want to say, well, I'll go and vote for somebody else, but I'm not voting for a party that appoints Mahuma Pela as a as the chair of a portfolio committee. But in South Africa, for me, it might be easy for you. That's not an easy choice for me either to decide who else to vote for. So you go and vote for some party just as a token that will never achieve political power. That doesn't seem the answer as well. But I agree with you. I mean, what can we say? I suppose what you can say is just be angry about it. Carry on being angry, and tell others exactly.
I was at a conference, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, and somebody was talking about the same things, but their conclusions were that we actually, and this was their suggestion, and eventually they said it's in jest. But how do you hold the political party responsible for what its people in government do? Because that party puts them there. Our electoral system, primarily we vote for the party and the party puts people in government. How do you put the pressure onto the political party? Do we sue, for example, the ANC for state capture? And that was a kind of mind-boggling thing, because we've not been thinking about those kinds of avenues. I think it goes back to also the issue of how do you change the power relations up to elections, where how do voters determine the actual agenda, and how do they then hold people accountable thereafter for it. What you have now is the reverse. People come in, they give you a set of things. None of us here, I can think, if I'm sure none of us will remember what is in that ANC manifesto and how much of that is in government policy now or will be. And in 5 years' time, are we able to monitor and track those things? And whether what is in the manifesto is in fact what the country requires in the first place. And that leads to the question that I was going to ask. What do you think is your own accountability work? Start with your councillor. How do you think you can hold your own councillor accountable? How do you think you can hold your own post office, your own police station accountable in your area? What is it that you can do around accountability work? What knowledge, what skills, what expertise would you require to do this? Who can you rally around to do that kind of thing? And I raise this because just the small post office thing has triggered off a whole lot of ideas about local accountability, local scrutiny, and then building up uh, and see where that goes.
I think that Shan is absolutely right. And you know, I'd like to just briefly describe to you one program that we're involved in now, which is around the police, where we won a competition organized by Google and got a fairly big grant as a result of it. And what we're doing with that is we are setting up, we are gathering data on every police station in the country, and that data will be captured on an accessible platform, accessible on all sorts of phones and accessible to the public, that will allow communities to not only report experiences of police corruption, but it will tell them how many vehicles are there supposed to be here, who's the commanding officer, where is the police station, do they have facilities for dealing with rape, for example, um, what is their crime fighting record. And so it will enable communities to call their own police stations to account, but also to rate them compared to others. So, you know, why is the Parkview police station much better resourced than the Orange Farm police station? Um, and that's, you know, our way of saying, you know, it does start, as Shan says, it actually starts in the communities. And that's why sometimes I'm a little bit critical of anti-corruption organizations that only focus on the big ESCOM story or the big Transnet story. I mean, it's down there at the ground where people make up their minds whether they've got a decent government or not, whether when they decide to take the law into their own hands or not to vote, or whatever the case may be. It's in those kind of situations about the filthy post office or the crooked police station commander, whatever the case may be.
Okay, so I'd like, Chan, in your response, just also proceed on to your concluding remarks and, you know, leave us with a few thoughts. You've already asked us some questions that we need to mull over in our minds. And then after that, maybe David can give us his concluding remarks. And then hopefully you guys will just stay around for a little bit more so that people can engage with you individually if they would like to. There's still those books available for volunteers. You can report to Angelo on which one of the organizations that come through you've volunteered for that book. But let's proceed with Sean and then David and conclude. Thank you.
There's a by-election coming up. Yesterday I went and I met the ANC candidate. I'll meet the DHF next week or so. And I said to him, well, how do you think you must be accountable to the people of this ward? He says, well, my phone number will be available. And I can be on whatever WhatsApp groups there are. And that was the sum total of his thinking about accountability. And that struck me that even those who are representatives have not thought about how they need to be accountable to their communities, to their voters, to the residents of particular areas. And that's where I think a lot of engagement would now need to start, and we need to start thinking of our models in these regards. Not just for the institutions, but it's for the people themselves. Councillors were meant to have had report back meetings, ward meetings, and so forth. But those of you who've gone to those things, if they have happened, by and large, they're political party gatherings. The IDP was supposed to be a major intervention for participation and for accountability. Hasn't really gone in that regard. So there is scope for, I think, new thinking around accountability models, right from the local up to, I suppose, the national levels. What we do have at the moment is a political system that really doesn't encourage accountability. It's something we have to fight for. We have to stretch it, and win those victories and build the models that can be scaled up to have national relevance.
I don't really have much to say by way of conclusion. I mean, it's been very interesting and thought provoking, engaging with you. You know, I think, but in relation to us, I think the question that I think Takira raised about how to work with campuses, how to work with the youth, I would really like to explore this further, because I do think that you guys have some things to answer for as well. I mean, we started to try to work with campuses, which was probably a bad idea at the time of the fees must fall, when it was at its height. And I found then, and I find now, some of the difficulties of working, dare I say it, with your generation, but maybe most particularly with campuses, is in the reluctance to convert your social movements into institutions, and to identify leaders and to hold them to account. And you know, I sometimes wonder when you say our leaders are in jail. I agree with you. Those leaders shouldn't be in jail, but very often they seem to be leaders because they went to jail, rather than people who were leaders at the time of the Fees Must Fall campaign. And it's very difficult for institutions structured in the way that we are to engage with organizations that celebrate their leaderlessness in some ways. So they're not leaders who you can go and hold to account or engage with or can hold you to account. And I think it's something that campuses and generations like this need to examine. And I'm not sure if it's because you think that the the powers that be will victimize leaders that you appoint, or whether because you don't trust each other sufficiently to actually identify leaders, because you think that every time, and I can understand why you think this, every time as a leader is elected, he or she is corrupted. But it's very difficult to engage with formal organizations when there is no sort of equivalent institutional arrangement to engage in. And I think that the upshot of that is that social movements flare with and then disappear because they're not sufficiently institutionalized. I don't know whether that resonates with you guys or not, but it has been a little bit our experience.
I think you've just opened yourself up to a 1 hour conversation with Akira after this. To Shane and to David, thank you so much for availing yourselves today. You're always very responsive to us when we call out for your time. And in this age where we have multiple demands of our time, we do really appreciate you, spending this morning with us. I'm not sure if we can take lunch early or not. Okay. So we are due for lunch at 1 o'clock. You guys are welcome to join us for lunch also. Fully catered on the bill of Wits University or on Karuna's WCCO budget. But again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your attention and your questions. We'll see you at lunch at 1 o'clock. And the next session after this one is the media as a civil actor. in holding government accountable and the private sector accountable. So thank you so much to everyone. Goodbye.